David's voice was tight with remembered anger, but also with understanding. That hurt, not just because it was insulting, but because it felt like confirmation of something we've been afraid of. That honor doesn't matter, that doing the right thing doesn't make any difference, that we're suffering for nothing. The silence was profound. He had articulated something they had all felt but couldn't name. So when he insulted us, David continued, "We didn't just want revenge for the words. We wanted revenge for everything, for all the suffering, for all the hardship, for all the times we've done the right thing and gotten nothing but trouble for it." Nabal became the symbol of everyone who had ever wronged us, everyone who had ever dismissed us, everyone who made us feel worthless. "And we were going to make him pay," someone said quietly. "We were going to make him pay," David agreed. "We were going to hurt him so badly that no one would ever dare treat us that way again. We were going to prove that we mattered, that we had power, that insulting us came with terrible consequences." He paused, then added softly, "We were going to become exactly what Saul always claimed we were. Violent, dangerous, unpredictable men who couldn't be trusted with power because we'd use it to hurt anyone who crossed us." The weight of those words settled over the camp like a physical presence. "But Abigail stopped us," David said, "not with force, not with threats, with wisdom. She reminded us that we're better than our worst impulses, that being chosen by God means something, that future kings don't slaughter innocent people to satisfy wounded pride." He stood again, looking around at his men. "Here's what I learned tonight. Real strength isn't about being willing to use violence. It's about being able to choose not to use violence when every part of you wants to. True power isn't destroying your enemies. It's being able to show mercy when you have every right to seek vengeance." One of the younger men spoke up. "But sir, doesn't that make us look weak? If people think they can insult you without consequences—" "Let me answer that," David said firmly. "What happened tonight will be talked about. Nabal's shepherds saw what he did. His servants know what he said. And soon they'll learn that 400 armed men were coming to destroy them, and that we turned back because one woman spoke wisdom. We let that sink in. Which story makes us look stronger? That we slaughtered innocent people because their master insulted us? Or that we were wise enough to listen to truth, strong enough to control our anger, and secure enough in our authority that we could show mercy without fear?" "The second one," someone said slowly, "because the first one just makes us look like bandits. But the second one makes us look like actual leaders." "Exactly." David said, "Bandits kill to prove they're dangerous. Leaders show restraint to prove they're strong. We're not bandits. We never were, and we won't become them now." The conversation continued long into the night. Men talked about what they had learned, what they had almost become, what Abigail's intervention had meant. The food was distributed fairly, consumed gratefully, appreciated not just for its substance, but for what it represented. Meanwhile, David sat alone for a time, thinking about the future, and about kingship, about the kind of ruler he wanted to become, about the lessons that came from unexpected sources. Abigail had been right about everything. If he had killed Nabal's household, it would have haunted him forever. Every time he sat in judgment as king, every time he claimed moral authority, every time he tried to lead with wisdom, that one night of vengeance would have undermined everything. "Sir," David looked up to find Joab standing nearby. "I just wanted to say thank you for listening to her, for having the courage to change course. I know how hard that must have been with all of us ready for blood, with your honor at stake, with everything screaming for vengeance." David nodded slowly. "You know what was hardest? Admitting she was right, admitting I was wrong. To standing in front of all of you and confessing that I had led us toward disaster. That's what made it powerful." Joab said, You're strong enough to admit error. That's rare, sir. That's the kind of thing that makes men willing to follow you into anything. After Joab left, David sat alone under the stars, thinking about a woman riding through the wilderness, about courage that looked like bowing in the dust, about strength that manifested as wisdom rather than violence. He thought about Nabal, drunk and oblivious, completely unaware of how close he had come to death, completely unaware that his wife had just saved his life, completely unaware that he was now living on borrowed time, his reputation shredded, his household knowing exactly what kind of man he was. David felt no satisfaction in Nabal's continued existence, no frustration that the man who had insulted him would face no immediate consequences, just a kind of profound relief that he had not become a murderer of innocent people, that his soul remained unstained, that he could still look at himself and see someone worthy of God's anointing. Tomorrow they would wake up to the same struggles, the same hunger, the same danger, the same uncertain future. Nothing had changed about their circumstances, but everything had changed about David, about his understanding of leadership, about his grasp of what it meant to be chosen by God for something greater than survival. He had been tested tonight, not by an external enemy, not by Saul's pursuit, not by the hardships of the wilderness. He had been tested by his own anger, his own wounded pride, his own capacity for vengeance, and he had passed the test. Not because he was strong enough on his own, but because he had been humble enough to listen when wisdom spoke. That was the real lesson. That was what he would carry forward. That was what Abigail had taught him. The greatest battles aren't always fought against external enemies. Sometimes they're fought against yourself, against your worst impulses, against the voice that tells you violence is the answer, that vengeance is justice, that power means never having to show restraint. And sometimes, just sometimes, God sends someone to help you win those battles. Someone willing to speak truth. Someone brave enough to interrupt your anger. Someone wise enough to remind you of who you really are. David looked up at the same stars that had shone on the night he had been anointed by Samuel. The same stars that had witnessed his victory over Goliath. The same stars that would someday shine over his kingdom. "Thank you," he whispered into the night. "Thank you for sending her. Thank you for saving me from myself. Thank you for reminding me that being chosen means choosing wisely." The stars offered no answer. That somewhere in the darkness, a woman was returning to her husband's estate, and the night was filled with the quiet miracle of violence prevented, wisdom honored, and souls preserved. Chapter 9. Consequence without revenge. Abigail returned to find the celebration still raging. If anything, it had intensified in her absence. The courtyard blazed with torches that threw dancing shadows across stone walls. Music pounded through the night air, drums and flutes playing the kind of increasingly sloppy rhythms that spoke of musicians who had consumed too much wine. Servants rushed back and forth with more food, more drink, their faces flushed with exhaustion and perhaps their own secret drinking. And at the center of it all sat Nabal, more drunk than Abigail had ever seen him. His face was red and swollen. His words were slurred. His movements were uncoordinated. His gestures broad and meaningless. He was holding court to a dwindling audience. Most of the important guests had already left, leaving only the hangers-on and sophons who had nowhere better to be. Abigail slipped through the crowds unnoticed. In the chaos of the celebration, one more person moving through the courtyard drew no attention. She returned the pack animals to their pens, ensured they had water and feed. And the servants who had helped her gather supplies were nowhere to be seen. They had made themselves scarce, knowing that questions might be asked, and that the less they knew, the safer they would be. She made her way to her chambers, removed her traveling clothes and changed into nightwear. Her body ached from the ride, from the tension, from the adrenaline that was finally draining away now that the crisis had passed. Her hands were shaking slightly, delayed reaction to what she had just done, to how close everything had come to disaster. She could hear the celebration continuing outside. Noble's voice shouting something incomprehensible, laughter breaking pottery. Someone had dropped or thrown something. The sounds of excess, of waste, of celebration without purpose or meaning. Abigail lay down but did not sleep, could not sleep. Her mind kept returning to the wilderness, to David's face in the torchlight, to the moment when fury had transformed into relief, to the knowledge that 400 men had been moments away from committing an act that would have haunted them forever. She had done it. Somehow, impossibly, she had done it. She had ridden into darkness and spoken truth to power and changed the trajectory of destruction. But the night was not over. She still had to face her husband, still had to tell him what had happened, still had to make him understand how close he had come to death, how his wife had saved him, how his arrogance had nearly destroyed everything. So she waited, waited for the celebration to wind down, waited for the last guest to stumble away, waited for her husband's inevitable collapse into drunken stupor. The sounds gradually faded, and the music stopped. Voices grew quieter, then silent. By the time dawn began to lighten the eastern sky, the estate was finally still. Abigail rose, washed her face. Dressed in simple day clothes, she moved through the quiet household, past servants who were already beginning the massive cleanup from the night's excess. They looked at her with a mixture of curiosity and concern. Some of them suspected something had happened, but none of them knew what. She found Noble in the main hall, exactly where she expected. He was slumped in his chair, his expensive robes stained with wine and food. His mouth was open, snoring audibly. The hall stank of wine and sweat in the aftermath of overindulgence. Abigail had a servant bring water and bread, the traditional remedy for terrible hangovers. Then she waited. She sat in the hall, and watching the sun rise through the windows, watching her husband gradually surface from his drunken sleep. It took hours. The sun was well up, the day growing warm before Nabal finally stirred. He groaned, clutched his head, squinted against the light. His face was pale now, the ruddy flush replaced by the grayish-green pallor of someone seriously regretting their previous night's choices. "Water?" he croaked. Abigail brought it to him personally. He drank deeply, grimacing at the taste, his hands shaking so badly that water sloshed onto his robes. "What time is it?" he muttered. "Late morning," Abigail said calmly. "The celebration went very late." "Good celebration," Nabal said, though he sounded like he was trying to convince himself. "Showed everyone. Showed them what real success looks like." "Yes," Abigail agreed. "And you certainly showed them something." Something in her tone made him look up sharply, though the movement clearly hurt his head. "What do you mean by that?" "I need to tell you something," Abigail said, her voice level and controlled. "About what happened yesterday about the messengers who came from David. Those beggars. I sent them away, taught them a lesson about respect." "You did teach them a lesson," Abigail said. "You taught them that Nabal of Maon values his pride more than his life, that he would rather insult desperate men than honor those who protected his property, that he considers himself too important to follow basic traditions of hospitality." Nabal's eyes narrowed even through the pain of his hangover. "What are you talking about?" Abigail sat down across from him, her posture straight, her voice steady. "After you dismissed David's messengers with insults, David armed 400 men and marched on our estate. He swore by God that by morning every male in this household would be dead. Every man, every boy, everyone who benefits from your wealth. All of us dead. The words penetrated slowly through the fog of Nabal's hangover. His face, already pale, went even paler. His hands, already shaking, began to tremble more violently. That's not possible. It's completely possible, Abigail said. I heard what you did. I heard the insults you delivered, and I knew exactly what would happen. So I took matters into my own hands. You what? I gathered provisions from our storehouses. Bread, wine, sheep, grain, raisins, figs, everything your messenger should have brought to David when he asked. Everything you should have given freely but refused out of arrogance. I loaded it all onto pack animals and I rode out alone to meet David before he could reach our estate. Nabal was staring at her now, his mouth hanging open, his bloodshot, eyes wide with shock and dawning comprehension. I met him in the wilderness, Abigail continued, her voice never wavering. He was coming with 400 armed warriors. They had their swords drawn. They were ready to kill everyone here. And I bowed before him. I took responsibility for your offense. I appealed to his better nature, reminded him of who he is and who he's meant to become. I asked him to spare us. You had no right. I had every right, Abigail said sharply, all the fear and anger and frustration of the night finally breaking through her controlled exterior. I had the right of someone trying to save lives. I had the right of someone married to a fool who was too drunk to understand what he had done. I had the right of someone who actually cares whether innocent people live or die. Nabal tried to stand, but his legs wouldn't support him. He collapsed back into his chair, his breathing becoming rapid and shallow. David listened to me, Abigail said, pressing her advantage. He thanked me. He blessed me for my wisdom. He said I had kept him from bloodshed and from avenging himself with his own hands. He turned his entire army around and went back to the wilderness because of me, not because of you. You were here drunken, celebrating, completely unaware that death was coming while I was in the wilderness, risking my life to save yours. She leaned forward, her voice dropping to something more intense, more personal. You insulted a man anointed by God to be king. You mocked warriors who protected your property. You violated every tradition of hospitality and honor, and your wife had to fix what your arrogance broke. Nabal's face had gone from pale to gray. His eyes were wide, staring at nothing. His breathing was coming in gasps now, shallow and quick. Sweat beaded on his forehead, despite the coolness of the hall. You took my property. You gave it to that outlaw. I saved your life, Abigail said flatly. I saved everyone's lives, and yes, I used your precious property to do it because apparently your wealth is more important to you than the lives of everyone in this household. Nabal was clutching at his chest now. His face had taken on a strange, frozen quality. His breath was coming in short, panicked gasps. Abigail stood quickly. "Someone get a physician," she called. "Now!" Servants came running. They helped Nabal to a couch, loosened his robes, tried to help him breathe, but his condition was deteriorating rapidly. His whole body had begun to shake. His eyes rolled back. His skin took on a bluish tinge. The physician arrived and examined him quickly. His heart, he said quietly to Abigail. The shock, the fear. It's too much for him. My lady, I don't think. Do what you can, Abigail said. But she already knew it was too late. Nabal was dying, not from David's sword, but from fear, from the sudden realization of his own mortality, from the weight of consequences he had never believed would actually come. He had not been struck down by an enemy. He had not been killed in battle. He had been undone by the truth, by the knowledge that his arrogance had brought disaster, that his wife had saved him from destruction he deserved, that he had been completely powerless and completely wrong. For 10 days Nabal lingered. His body became like stone, paralyzed, unable to move or speak. He lay in his bed, his eyes staring at the ceiling, his mind presumably trapped in the horror of what had happened, what he had done, what he had almost caused. Abigail tended to him during those days, not out of love. She had never loved him, not out of duty alone, though duty played a part, but out of a kind of mercy that he had never shown to anyone else. She ensured he was clean, comfortable, that physicians did what they could. She sat with him sometimes, though she said nothing. There was nothing left to say. On the 10th day, his heart finally gave out completely. Nabal died without ever speaking another word, without ever acknowledging what had happened, without ever understanding that his wife's wisdom had been worth more than all his wealth. The household mourned appropriately, but without deep grief. Nabal had not been loved. He had been endured. People showed respect for the dead because that's what you did, but there were no tears, no genuine sorrow, no sense of real loss. They buried him in the family tomb with all appropriate ceremony. Wealthy men came to pay their respects, though several of them privately remarked on how fitting it was that Nabal had died from his own arrogance rather than from any external attack. Abigail stood by the grave and felt empty, not glad, not sad, just empty. She had saved him from violence only to watch him destroy himself from within. She had given him a chance to change, to learn, to become something better than what he was. But some people cannot change. Some people are so locked into their own arrogance that even deliverance feels like an attack. She turned from the grave and walked back toward the house. She was a widow now, technically free, though freedom in the ancient world for women was always conditional, always limited. She would need to figure out what came next, whether to stay in this household that held so many difficult memories, whether to return to her family, whether to build some new life from the ashes of the old. She did not know that David had already heard of Nabal's death. I did not know that he was at that very moment sending messengers to her with an offer that would change her life again. She knew only that she had done what was right, had spoken when silence would have been easier, had acted when inaction would have been safer, had stepped between anger and violence, and spoken truth that saved lives. In a world of cruelty and vengeance, that was its own kind of victory. Not the victory of seeing your enemies destroyed, but the quieter, deeper victory of knowing you had maintained your integrity, honored wisdom, chosen life over death. She walked back to the house, her head high, her conscience clear, and in the distance messengers were already riding toward her with news that would begin the next chapter of her remarkable life. Epilogue, the strength of peace. The messengers from David arrived 3 weeks after Nabal's burial. They came formally, respectfully, bearing a request that made the entire household hold its breath and exchange wondering looks. David, son of Jesse, the anointed future king of Israel, was asking Abigail to become his wife. It was not entirely unexpected, though it was still surprising. Everyone knew that David had been impressed by her wisdom. Everyone had heard the stories somewhat embellished with each telling of how she had ridden into the wilderness and turned back an army with nothing but words. Everyone understood that she had demonstrated qualities that any wise leader would value, but still a marriage proposal from David himself. The request was carefully worded, showing the same respect that had characterized their first meeting. I had acknowledged Abigail's recent widowhood, gave her full freedom to refuse, and made clear that this was an offer, not a demand. David was not trying to acquire her as property or add her to a collection. He was asking her to partner with him to bring her wisdom and courage to his household, to stand beside him as he waited for God's promises to unfold. Abigail considered the offer carefully. She was under no illusions about what life with David would mean. More hardship in the wilderness, continued danger from Saul's pursuit, uncertainty about the future, sharing a husband with other wives. David was already married to Michal, Saul's daughter, though they were separated by circumstances, and he would likely marry others for political and practical reasons. But she also understood what the offer represented. A chance to escape the legacy of Nabal's foolishness, an opportunity to use her gifts in service of something greater than managing an estate, a partnership with a man who had demonstrated the capacity to listen to wisdom, to change course when shown a better path, to value truth over pride. She accepted. The marriage was simple, conducted in David's wilderness camp with his men as witnesses. There was no grand celebration, no elaborate ceremony, just the binding of two lives together, the mutual commitment to support each other through whatever came next. And what came next was everything the stories had promised and more. Abigail stood beside David through the final years of Saul's pursuit. She counseled him when anger threatened to override wisdom. She reminded him of who he was meant to become when circumstances tempted him toward expedient rather than righteous choices. She helped manage the complex household of a man with multiple wives, mediating conflicts, smoothing tensions, ensuring the personal drama did not undermine collective survival. When Saul finally fell in battle and David was crowned king, first over Judah and then over all Israel, Abigail was there. She saw him take the throne she had referenced that night in the wilderness. She watched him establish his kingdom, deal with enemies, administer justice, build something lasting from years of struggle, and David never forgot what she had taught him. Never forgot the night when a woman's courage had saved him from becoming a murderer. Never forgot that true strength sometimes looked like restraint. That real power sometimes manifested as wisdom rather than force. Throughout his reign, whenever anger threatened to drive him toward vengeance, he would remember Abigail, would remember her bowing in the dust, would remember her words about not carrying the burden of needless bloodshed, would remember that being chosen by God meant acting like it. He was not perfect. David's reign was marked by both brilliance and catastrophic failures. He would sin grievously, would fail spectacularly, would make decisions that brought devastating consequences. But he never forgot the lesson Abigail had taught him, that wisdom guided by faith could interrupt destruction before it began. The story of that night in the wilderness became part of his legend. Not the famous stories, not his defeat of Goliath or his victories in battle or his accomplishments as king, but the quieter story of how he had been saved from himself, how a woman's courage had preserved his soul, how wisdom had triumphed over wrath. Abigail lived to see David's kingdom established, to see the promises God had made beginning to unfold, to see the man she had stopped from committing atrocity become the greatest king Israel would know. She bore him a son, gave him counsel that shaped his reign, stood as evidence that sometimes the greatest warriors need to be saved from their own strength. Her legacy was not in monuments or military victories. It was in a single night when she had ridden into darkness to save people who didn't even know they needed saving. When she had spoken truth that changed a future king's heart. When she had proved that wisdom guided by faith can stop destruction before it ever begins. The story would be told and retold for thousands of years in synagogues and churches, in late-night conversations and formal teachings, in moments when people needed to remember that peace is not weakness, that restraint is strength, that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is step between anger and violence and say, wait, think, remember who you are. Because that is what Abigail did. She remembered who David was when he was in danger of forgetting. She saw the king in the desperate fugitive. She recognized the man chosen by God and the warrior consumed by rage. She spoke to his best self when his worst self was demanding satisfaction, and he listened. That is the real miracle. Not that she spoke, but that he heard. Not that she offered wisdom, but that he had the humility to receive it. Not that she interrupted his anger, but that he let himself be interrupted. In a world that celebrates strength and power, that honors the ability to crush enemies and dominate opposition, their story offers something different, something quieter, but infinitely more powerful. It offers the possibility that we can choose peace, that we can let anger go, that we can listen to wisdom even when it comes from unexpected sources, that we can be saved from ourselves if we're willing to hear truth when it's offered. Abigail's legacy is not in the violence she prevented, though that alone would be significant. Her legacy is in what she proved about the power of wisdom, the strength of restraint, the possibility of peace. She showed that you don't need an army to stop a war. You need courage. You need wisdom. You need the willingness to speak truth to power, to step into danger for the sake of others, to appeal to the better nature of someone consumed by their worst impulses. And David showed that true strength means being able to change direction when shown a better path. That real power includes the power to show mercy, that being chosen by God means acting like someone who understands that might does not make right, and that vengeance, however justified it feels, carries costs that echo through eternity. Together, they demonstrated something the world desperately needs to learn and relearn. That wisdom, guided by faith, can interrupt violence before it begins. That peace is not the absence of conflict, but the active choice to transform conflict through truth and courage, and the willingness to appeal to the best in people rather than assuming their worst. May we all have such strength when our moment comes. May we all be willing to ride into darkness and speak truth to power. And may we all be humble enough when wisdom comes to meet us to stop and listen and let ourselves be saved from our own worst impulses. That is the lesson of Abigail. That is the gift she gave David. That is the hope she offers us all thousands of years later in a world that still struggles with the same questions about anger and justice, about vengeance and mercy, about when to fight and when to pursue peace. Peace is not weakness. It is wisdom in action. And sometimes it is the bravest thing anyone can choose. Hello, dear friends, and welcome to Sacred Slumber. And before we begin tonight's story, I'd love to know, how has your day been? Whether it's evening where you are, or perhaps the middle of the night, or even early morning on the other side of the world, you're so welcome here. What time is it in your corner of the world right now? And where are you listening from tonight? Whether you're in a bustling city or a quiet countryside in the mountains or by the ocean, you belong in this peaceful space we're creating together. If this is your first time with us, welcome to our community of seekers finding rest in ancient wisdom. And if you're returning, thank you for being part of this journey. Don't forget to subscribe to Sacred Slumber so you never miss these moments of peace and reflection that we share together. Now, let's settle in as we travel back to ancient Israel, to a time of prophets and miracles, to discover a story about trust, provision, and the surprising ways that hope can multiply in our darkest hours. The morning sun cast long shadows across the dusty village streets, but Miriam barely noticed its warmth. She stood in the doorway of her small stone house, watching her two young sons sleep on their woven mats, their faces peaceful in the golden light. For a moment she allowed herself to pretend that everything was as it had been before the illness took her husband, before the debts mounted like stones upon her chest, before the collectors began their visits with increasingly stern voices and hardening faces. But pretending was a luxury she could no longer afford. The sound of approaching footsteps made her stomach clench with familiar dread. She knew that measured pace, those heavy sandals against the packed earth. The debt collectors had returned, and this time she knew they would not leave empty-handed. Miriam's husband, Obadiah, had been a good man, a servant in the school of prophets, devoted to following Elisha and learning the ways of the Lord. But goodness, she had learned, did not always translate to prosperity. When the drought had stretched on for months, when the harvest had failed, Obadiah had borrowed money to keep food on their table and oil in their lamps. He had been certain that better times were coming, that the Lord would provide as he always had. Then the fever came, swift and merciless, taking over dire before the rains returned, before the debts could be repaid, and before he could see his sons grow into men. Now 3 men stood at her threshold, their faces grim with business. The lead collector, a man named Josiah, with calculating eyes and soft hands that had never known hard labor, stepped forward. "Miriam, widow of Obadiah," he announced formally, though they all knew each other's names in this small village. "The time for payment has come and gone. Your husband's debts must be settled." Miriam's throat felt as dry as sand. "Please, I have explained our situation. I am a widow with nothing. Give me more time, and I will find a way." "Time is a luxury that costs money," Josiah interrupted, his voice neither cruel nor kind, simply matter of fact. "We have been patient, but patience does not feed our families or pay our own obligations. The law is clear about what must be done when debts cannot be paid." Behind him, the other 2 men shifted uncomfortably. They knew what came next, and while they might not relish it, they would not hesitate to carry out what the law demanded. "Your sons," Josiah continued, his eyes flicking toward the doorway where the boys still slept. "They will come with us. 7 years of service will settle your husband's debt. It is more merciful than we are required to be." The words hit Miriam like a physical blow. She gripped the door frame to keep from falling, her knuckles white against the worn wood. 7 years. Her sons were only 8 and 10 years old. By the time they returned, they would be grown men who barely remembered their mother's face. "No," she whispered, then louder. "No, please. They're all I have left. There must be another way." But even as she spoke, she knew the futility of her words. She had nothing of value to offer. No jewelry, no livestock, no land. The house itself belonged to her husband's brother, who had graciously allowed her to remain, but could offer no financial help of his own. "I will give you until tomorrow morning to say your goodbyes," Josiah said, and there was perhaps the smallest note of sympathy in his voice. "We will return at sunrise." As the men walked away, their sandals raising small clouds of dust that caught the morning light, Miriam sank to her knees in the doorway. The weight of hopelessness pressed down upon her like a stone, threatening to crush what little breath remained in her lungs. Her sons stirred behind her, waking to another day they assumed would be like all the others. Simple, poor perhaps, but together. How could she tell them that their childhood was about to end? How could she explain that the law that was meant to protect would now tear their family apart? But as the sun climbed higher and the reality of her situation settled like dust around her, Miriam remembered something her husband used to say when times were difficult. "When we have nowhere else to turn, we can always turn upward." Obadiah had learned this truth in his years following the prophet Elisha, and even in death his faith whispered to her across the veil of grief. Elisha, the prophet, was still in the region, still teaching and performing the wonders that had made him famous throughout Israel and beyond. If anyone could help her, if anyone might know a way where there seemed to be no way, it would be the man of God who had been her husband's teacher and guide. Miriam rose to her feet, dust falling from her simple brown robe. She looked back at her sons, now awake and eating the last of their bread, with the unconscious contentment of children who trust that tomorrow will somehow provide for itself. "Aaron, Micah," she called softly. "I must go into the village. Stay close to home and watch out for each other." The boys nodded, accustomed to their mother's brief errands, unaware that she was about to embark on a journey that would either save their family or confirm their worst fears. As Miriam walked through the village streets, her heart hammered against her ribs like a caged bird. The prophet Elisha was known to be staying with a family on the far side of the village, and with each step she rehearsed what she would say, how she would explain their desperate situation without sounding like she was demanding a miracle. But by the time she reached the modest house where Elisha was lodging, all her carefully planned words had evaporated like morning dew. She stood at the gate, paralyzed by the enormity of what she was about to ask, and the crushing possibility that even a prophet might not be able to help her. The courtyard was quiet except for the gentle murmur of voices from within the house. Miriam could see Elisha through the open doorway, seated on a low cushion with several young men gathered around him, students perhaps, or local villagers seeking wisdom. His presence was immediately recognizable, not because of any physical grandeur, but because of a quality of stillness that seemed to radiate from him like heat from a hearth. Miriam had seen the prophet before, of course, in a village this small, and everyone knew when such a significant figure was present. She had watched from a distance as people brought their sick children for healing, their troubled hearts for counsel, their impossible situations for divine intervention. But she had never imagined herself among their number, never thought her own need would drive her to such a desperate act. A woman emerged from the house, evidently the hostess. Noticed Miriam standing uncertainly at the gate. "Can I help you, sister?" the woman asked kindly. But there was a protective quality in her voice. She had probably dealt with many people seeking the prophet's attention. Before Miriam could answer, Elisha's voice came from within. "Let her come. The Lord has brought her here for a reason." The woman's expression immediately softened, and she gestured for Miriam to enter. "Come, the prophet will see you." Miriam's legs felt unsteady as she crossed the threshold. The young men who had been listening to Elisha's teaching respectfully moved aside, creating a space for her to approach. The prophet's eyes, kind but penetrating, met hers, and she felt as though he could see not just her present desperation, but the entire story of her life written in her face. "You're Odiah's widow," Elisha said gently. It was not a question. Miriam nodded, surprised that he knew her by sight. "Yes, my lord, I am Miriam. Your husband was a faithful servant, both to the Lord and to this community. His loss has been felt by many." Elisha's words were spoken with genuine warmth. Miriam felt tears prick at her eyes, partly from grief that was still fresh, partly from gratitude that someone remembered her husband's worth. "Thank you, my lord," she managed, "but I have come because the words stuck in her throat like thorns. How did one ask a holy man to solve what seemed unsolvable? Speak freely, daughter. What troubles you?" The kindness in his voice broke through her restraint, like water through a cracked dam. The whole story poured out: the debts, the collectors, the threat to take her sons, the sunrise deadline that loomed like an executioner's blade. She spoke of her husband's faithful service, of their family's long devotion to the Lord, of her complete bewilderment at how faithfulness could lead to such devastating circumstances. When she finished, the courtyard was silent, except for the distant sound of children playing in another street, a sound that reminded Miriam acutely of what she stood to lose. Elisha listened without interruption, his expression grave, but not hopeless. When she fell silent, he sat quietly for a moment, as though listening to a voice only he could hear. Finally he spoke. "Tell me, what do you have in your house?" The question caught Miriam off guard. What did she have? The very essence of her problem was that she had nothing. No money, no valuables, no resources with which to pay her debts or provide for her family. "Nothing, my lord," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I have nothing at all." But Elisha's gaze remained steady, patient. "Look again. What do you have in your house?" Miriam searched her memory, walking through their small home in her mind. A few pieces of simple furniture, some clay pots, worn clothing, sleeping mats, nothing of any value. Certainly nothing that could solve a debt large enough to require 7 years of servitude to repay. Then she remembered, there is a small jar of olive oil," she said hesitantly. "Just a little, barely enough for a few meals." She almost apologized for mentioning something so insignificant, but the prophet's face had changed. There was something in his expression now, not quite a smile, but a kind of quiet intensity that made the air in the courtyard feel charged with possibility. "A jar of oil," Elisha repeated thoughtfully. "How much oil?" "Very little, my lord. Perhaps enough to fill a cup, no more." The prophet nodded slowly, as though this small detail was exactly what he had been hoping to hear. He stood up, his movements deliberate and purposeful. "Here is what you must do," he said, his voice carrying the authority of someone who spoke not just his own words, but those of the Almighty. "Go to all your neighbors, not just the ones nearby, but throughout the village. Ask them to lend you their empty jars and vessels. Don't ask for just a few. Collect as many as you can carry." Miriam blinked in confusion. Empty jars? What good would empty vessels do when her problem was that she had nothing to fill them with? "I don't understand, my lord. If I had oil to fill jars, I would not be in this position." "Understanding comes after obedience, not before," Elisha said. But his tone was gentle, not reproving. "Trust in the Lord's provision, even when his ways seem strange to our human reasoning." He continued with his instructions. "When you have gathered the empty vessels, go into your house with your sons. Close the door. This miracle is not for the curious eyes of the neighbors, but for the desperate faith of a mother. Then take your small jar of oil and begin to pour. Pour into what, my lord? Into the empty jars. Pour until they are full." The instructions seemed impossible, even absurd. How could she pour from a nearly empty jar into multiple vessels? The physical laws that govern their world simply didn't work that way. But as Miriam looked into the prophet's eyes, she saw something that gave her pause. Not madness, not delusion, but absolute certainty. This was a man who had seen the impossible become routine, who had learned to expect miracles the way others expected sunrise. "Do you trust me?" Elisha asked simply. Miriam thought of her sons sleeping peacefully this morning while she faced the possibility of never tucking them in again. She thought of her husband's faith, unwavering even in illness, even in poverty, even at the end. She thought of the alternative, doing nothing, accepting defeat, watching her children be led away at sunrise. "Yes, my Lord, I trust you." "Then go. The Lord will not fail you." As Miriam prepared to leave, one of the young men who had been listening spoke up. "Master, shouldn't we accompany her, help her carry the vessels?" But Elisha shook his head. "This work must be hers alone. Faith cannot be borrowed or carried by another. It must be exercised by the one who needs the miracle." Walking back through the village streets, Miriam felt as though she were in a dream. Or perhaps more accurately, as though she had just awakened from the nightmare of the past few months into a reality where impossible things might be possible. The prophet's instructions echoed in her mind. Collect empty jars, as many as possible, then pour from her nearly empty vessel into them. It made no earthly sense. But then again, Neither did most of the stories she had heard about Elisha and his master Elijah before him. Prophets who had called down fire from heaven, raised the dead, and fed multitudes with meager supplies. Perhaps the very impossibility of the instruction was itself a sign that she was about to witness something beyond the natural order. Her first stop was at the house of her neighbor Sarah, an elderly woman who had been kind to Miriam since Odia's death, often sharing vegetables from her garden when she had none to spare. "Sarah," Miriam called softly at the gate, "may I speak with you?" The older woman emerged, wiping flour from her hands on her apron. "Of course, child. You look different somehow. Is everything well?" Miriam almost laughed at the question. Nothing was well, and yet somehow everything felt different than it had this morning. "I need to ask a favor. Do you have any empty jars or vessels that I might borrow?" Sarah's eyebrows rose in surprise. Empty jars. Whatever for? How could Miriam explain without sounding like she had lost her mind? "The prophet Elisha has given me instructions. I need to gather as many empty containers as I can." To her credit, Sarah didn't ask for further explanation. In a community where prophets occasionally walked among them, people had learned that divine instructions often defied human logic. "I have several clay jars that I use for storing grain, but they're empty now since the harvest was so poor." "You're welcome to them. Let me help you carry them." As they loaded the vessels into Miriam's arm, Sarah's expression grew concerned. "Miriam, the whole village knows about your situation with the debt collectors. If there's anything else I can do, pray," Miriam said simply. "Pray that the Lord remembers his promises to care for widows and orphans." Her next stop was at the home of Rebecca, a woman with several children who had always been friendly but not particularly close. Here Miriam felt more nervous about making her request. "Rebecca, I know this will sound strange, but I need to borrow any empty jars or pots you might have." Rebecca looked puzzled, but not unfriendly. "Empty jars? Are you planning to store something? I heard about your troubles. Surely you're not thinking of buying oil or grain." "No, nothing like that. The prophet Elisha has asked me to collect empty vessels. I'm not entirely sure why, but I trust that he knows what he's doing." At the mention of Elisha's name, Rebecca's demeanor changed immediately. "The prophet gave you instructions. Of course, take whatever you need." "Children," she called into the house, "bring out all the jars and pots we're not using quickly now." Soon Miriam's arms were full again, and Rebecca's children were helping to carry the additional vessels. Word seemed to be spreading through the village. She could see neighbors emerging from their houses, curious about the unusual activity. By the time she reached the house of David the potter, she didn't even need to make a request. He was already waiting with an armload of clay vessels. Not his finest work, but good serviceable jars in various sizes. "I heard you were collecting empties on the prophet's instructions," he said with a grin. "I've got plenty of these. Consider it my contribution to whatever miracle is about to happen." "You really think there will be a miracle?" Miriam asked, suddenly feeling the weight of what she was attempting. So many people were now involved, so many witnesses to what would either be a tremendous demonstration of God's power or a devastating display of her own foolishness. David's expression grew serious. "I've lived in this village for 40 years, and I've seen 3 different prophets pass through. Not once have I seen one of them give instructions that didn't lead to something remarkable. The real question isn't whether there will be a miracle. It's whether we'll have enough faith to receive it." As Miriam continued through the village, she was amazed by the response. People she barely knew were offering their vessels, and those who had no jars to spare were spreading the word to others who might. Children ran ahead of her, announcing to each household what was needed. Even some of the village elders, usually stern and cautious about anything that disrupted the normal order, were nodding their approval and contributing what they could. By mid-afternoon, Miriam's small house was surrounded by more clay vessels than she had ever seen in one place. There were large storage jars that could hold enough oil for a family for months, medium-sized pitchers perfect for daily use, and small vessels suitable for lamps and cooking. Some were beautifully crafted, others rough and practical. Some were new, others showed the wear of years of faithful service. Her sons, Aaron and Micah, had awakened to find their home transformed into something resembling a pottery merchant stall. They helped carry the vessels inside, their eyes wide with excitement and confusion. "Mother, what are all these for?" Aaron asked. At 10, he was old enough to sense that something significant was happening, but young enough to find it more exciting than frightening. "We're going to fill them," Miriam said, the words sounding even stranger when spoken aloud to her children. "Fill them with what?" 8-year-old Micah wanted to know. Miriam looked at the small jar of oil sitting on their simple wooden table. The same jar she had mentioned to the prophet, containing perhaps a cup's worth of precious olive oil. It looked impossibly small, surrounded by all the empty vessels now crowding their one-room home. "With oil," she said, and saw her sons exchange the kind of look children give when they're certain their parent has said something that makes no sense but are too polite to argue. As the sun began to sink toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold, Miriam stood in her doorway one last time before following the prophet's final instruction. The village around her looked the same as it had this morning, but everything had changed. This morning she'd been a desperate woman with no options. Now she stood on the threshold of either a miracle or a disaster, but at least she was no longer passive in the face of her circumstances. She could see a few neighbors lingering in their own doorways, clearly curious about what would happen next. News of the prophet's instructions had spread throughout the village, and while no one was bold enough to ask for details, there was a sense of anticipation in the air, as though the entire community was holding its breath. Tomorrow morning, the debt collectors would return, expecting to claim her sons. But tonight belonged to faith, to the impossible, to the hope that a God who had parted seas and raised the dead might still care about one widow's desperate prayer. "Come, boys," she said, stepping back inside their small home. "It's time to close the door." The interior of their small house felt different with the door closed and the outside world shut away. The late afternoon light filtered through the single window, casting long shadows among the collection of empty vessels that now filled nearly every available space. Aaron and Micah stood close to their mother, sensing that they were about to witness something extraordinary, though they couldn't possibly understand what. Miriam picked up the small jar of oil with hands that trembled slightly, not from fear now, but from anticipation. The prophet had been so certain, so confident in his instructions. But looking at the meager amount of oil in her jar compared to the dozens of empty vessels surrounding them, she felt the weight of impossibility settling over her like a heavy cloak. "Mother," Aaron said quietly, "how can we fill all these jars with so little oil?" It was the question that had been echoing in her own mind, but hearing it from her son's lips made her realize that this moment was about more than just solving their financial crisis. Her children were watching, learning what it meant to trust when trust seemed foolish, to obey when obedience seemed pointless, to hope when hope seemed dead. "I don't know how, my son," she said honestly, "but the prophet told us to pour, so we will pour. Sometimes we must act on faith before we understand the reason." She moved to the largest jar first, a beautiful vessel that David the potter had contributed, large enough to hold oil for several months. As she lifted her small jar and positioned it over the opening, she whispered a prayer. "Lord God of Israel, you who cared for the widow of Zarephath in the days of Elijah, remember your servant and his children." The oil began to flow. At first it seemed natural. The golden liquid poured from her jar into the larger vessel with the normal splash and gurgle of any liquid being transferred. But as seconds passed, then minutes, Miriam realized that something impossible was happening. The oil continued to flow, steady and smooth. And yet when she looked at her own jar, it appeared as full as when she had started. "Mother," Micah whispered, his young voice filled with awe. "It's still coming." The first large jar filled completely, rich golden oil reaching its brim. Miriam looked at her own vessel, still full. Her hands began to shake, not with fear now, but with the overwhelming realization that she was witnessing the divine intervention of the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. "Bring me another jar," she said, her voice barely steady. Aaron quickly positioned a medium-sized pitcher beside her, and Miriam continued to pour. Again the oil flowed freely, filling the second vessel completely, while her own jar remained miraculously replenished. "Another," she said, and now her voice carried a note of growing excitement. Micah dragged over a small storage jar, and the process repeated. The oil flowed, the vessel filled, and still a small jar remained full to the brim. As they continued, a rhythm developed. The boys would position each new vessel. Miriam would pour until it was full. Then they would move it aside and bring the next one. With each jar they filled, their excitement grew, and what had begun as nervous obedience transformed into joyful celebration. "It's not stopping," Aaron laughed, no longer trying to whisper in the presence of miracle. "Mother, it's really not stopping." Miriam found herself laughing too, tears of relief and wonder streaming down her face as she poured jar after jar. The oil continued to flow, inexhaustible, impossible, absolutely real. This was the God her husband had served, the God who had parted the Red Sea and provided manna in the wilderness. And he was here in their small house multiplying oil for a desperate widow and her children. The sun set completely as they worked, and Aaron lit their oil lamp using oil from one of the newly filled jars. The warm light danced across the growing collection of filled vessels, each one a testament to divine provision, each one a step away from the disaster that had threatened to destroy their family. They filled the large storage jars first, then the medium pitches, then the smaller vessels for daily use. Oil for cooking, oil for lamps, oil for anointing, oil for trade. More oil than their family could use in a year, more than they could use in several years. "Mother," Micah said during a brief pause, "will we ever run out of empty jars?" Miriam looked around their home. They had filled perhaps half of the vessels they had collected, and still the oil flowed freely from her small jar. "I hope not, my son. I hope we never run out." But even as she spoke, she realized they were approaching the end of their supply of empty containers. Only a handful of vessels remained unfilled, the smallest ones suitable for perfumes and medicines. As she filled the second to last jar, a delicate little vessel that Rebecca had contributed, Miriam felt a change. The oil still flowed, but there was something different in its quality, as though it was beginning to recognize that its work was nearly complete. She reached for the final jar, the smallest one in the collection, barely large enough to hold oil for a single lamp. As she positioned her small jar above it and began to pour, the oil flowed out in a steady stream, filling the tiny vessel to its brim. And then, as suddenly as the miracle had begun, it stopped. Miriam tilted her jar in her trying to coax out even a few more drops, but it was empty. Completely, naturally, normally empty, as though the laws of physics had suddenly remembered themselves and returned to their usual operation. The silence that followed was profound. For hours, their small house had been filled with the sound of flowing oil, excited whispers, and occasional exclamations of wonder. Now, surrounded by dozens of filled vessels, they stood in the golden lamplight and absorbed the magnitude of what had just occurred. Aaron was the first to speak. "Is it over?" Miriam looked at her empty jar, then at the abundance surrounding them. "Yes, my son, it's over because we have no more empty vessels to fill." "What does that mean?" Micah asked. Before Miriam could answer, she remembered something the prophet had implied in his instructions. The miracle was not limited by the amount of oil God could provide, but by the amount of faith they could exercise, represented by the number of empty vessels they had been able to gather. "It means," she said slowly, understanding dawning on her like sunrise, "that God's provision is only limited by our capacity to receive it. If we had gathered 100 jars, he would have filled 100 jars if we had gathered 1,000. The implications took her breath away. They had gathered many vessels, yes, but now she wondered, could they have gathered more? Had their own limited vision constrained the miracle? It was a question that would follow her for the rest of her life, a reminder to always ask for more, expect more, prepare for more when seeking God's intervention. But such thoughts were for later reflection. Tonight, surrounded by the tangible evidence of divine love and provision, there was only gratitude and wonder. Tomorrow, she told her sons as they prepared for sleep among the filled vessels, we will go to the prophet and then to the marketplace. We will sell this oil, pay our debts, and secure our future. As her boys settled onto their sleeping mats, their faces glowing with excitement and the security of knowing they would not be taken away, Miriam sat beside the window and looked out at the village where she had lived her entire life. Tomorrow she would no longer be known as the desperate widow who had nothing. She would be the woman whom God had remembered, the mother whose children had been saved, the recipient of a miracle that would be told and retold for generations. But tonight, she was simply a woman who had learned that emptiness was not the absence of provision, but the presence of possibility. And that sometimes the most important thing you can bring to God is not what you have, but what you lack. The oil lamps flickered gently in the darkness, fueled by the miracle oil casting dancing shadows on the walls of their transformed home. And in the quiet of the night, Miriam whispered prayers of thanksgiving to the God who multiplies hope in the hands of those who dare to pour out their faith, one empty jar at a time. Morning came with a gentle golden light that seemed especially bright as it streamed through the window of their small house. Miriam awakened to a sight that confirmed the previous evening had not been a dream. Dozens of clay vessels filled with rich golden olive oil crowded every surface and corner of their home. Aaron and Micah were already awake, sitting among the jars with expressions of continued amazement, as though they expected the oil to disappear with the sunrise. "It's still here," Aaron said wonderingly. "All of it." "Did you think it wouldn't be?" Miriam asked, though she understood his disbelief. Miracles had a quality of unreality about them, even to those who experienced them directly. "I dreamed about it," Micah said. "I dreamed that we were pouring oil forever and ever, and there were jars as tall as trees, and the oil turned into rivers that flowed through the whole village." Miriam smiled at her younger son's imagination, but then paused to consider his words. In a way, wasn't that exactly what had happened? The oil had flowed beyond their immediate need, beyond their ability to contain it all, beyond what seemed possible in their small, constrained world. A knock at their door interrupted her thoughts. Through the window, she could see the familiar figure of Elisha standing in their courtyard, his presence as calm and assured as it had been the day before. "The prophet," Aaron whispered excitedly. Miriam quickly adjusted her headscarf and opened the door. her heart racing with anticipation and gratitude. "My lord," she said, bowing respectfully, "please come in and see what the Lord has done." Elisha entered their transformed home, his eyes taking in the abundance with what appeared to be satisfaction, but not surprise. This was clearly not the first time he had witnessed the Lord's provision in response to desperate faith. "It is well," he said simply, then looked directly at Miriam. "Tell me what happened." Though he had given the instructions and surely knew what to expect, Miriam realized he wanted to hear her testimony, to let her put into words the miracle she had experienced. So she told him everything: the gathering of vessels, the closing of the door, the first hesitant pour, the growing amazement as jar after jar filled with oil that seemed to come from an inexhaustible source. "We filled every vessel we had collected," she concluded. "When the last jar was full, the oil stopped flowing." Elisha nodded thoughtfully. "And what do you understand from this?" The question surprised her. She had expected congratulations, perhaps instructions for what to do next, but not an examination of her theological understanding. "I understand that the Lord remembers his promises to care for widows and orphans," she said slowly, "and that his provision is beyond what we can imagine or contain." "Yes," Elisha agreed. "And what else?" Miriam thought about the experience, about the rhythm of pouring and filling, about the moment when the oil finally stopped. "The miracle was limited only by our preparation," she said with growing insight. "If we had gathered more vessels, the oil would have continued to flow." Elisha confirmed, "God's provision is not constrained by scarcity, but by our capacity to receive abundance. Remember this lesson and teach it to your sons." He moved toward the door, then turned back with final instructions. "Now go, sell the oil and pay your debts. You and your sons will live on what remains." "How much should I sell?" Miriam asked. Suddenly, practical concerns rushing back as she realized she had no experience as a merchant. "Take the oil to the marketplace in portions. Don't flood the market all at once, or you'll drive down the price. Sell slowly over time, and you'll receive full value. The Lord has given you not just provision for today, but wisdom for managing tomorrow." After the prophet left, Miriam stood in her doorway, watching his retreating figure until he disappeared around a corner. Then she turned back to face her transformed reality. The first practical task was obvious. She needed to begin transporting oil to the market. But first, there was another matter to address. The sound of approaching footsteps made her look up. Three familiar figures were walking down her street, the debt collectors, returning as promised at sunrise to claim her sons. But this time, Miriam felt no fear, no desperate helplessness. She stood calmly in her doorway, watching their approach with something approaching pity for men who lived in a world too small to contain miracles. "Miriam," Josiah called as they drew near, "are you prepared to surrender the boys?" "I am prepared to pay the debt," she replied evenly. The three men stopped walking, clearly taken aback by her confident tone. "Pay the debt?" Josiah repeated skeptically. "Yesterday you claimed to have nothing. What has changed overnight?" "The Lord has provided," Miriam said simply. "I now have the means to settle my husband's obligations in full." She gestured toward her house where several of the oil jars were visible through the open doorway. "Olive oil of the finest quality, more than enough to cover what is owed, with plenty remaining for my family's future needs." The debt collectors exchanged glances, clearly struggling to process this unexpected development. "Where did you get oil?" one of them asked suspiciously. "You cannot simply produce valuable goods from nothing." "With the Lord, nothing is impossible," Miriam replied. "But if you doubt the quality or value, you are welcome to examine it for yourself." Josiah stepped forward and peered into the house. his eyes widening at the sight of dozens of filled vessels. He dipped his finger into the nearest jar and tasted the oil, his expression shifting from skepticism to amazement. "This is premium oil," he admitted reluctantly, "worth far more than your husband's debt." "Then we are agreed," Miriam said. "I will deliver payment to you within 3 days once I have sold sufficient oil in the marketplace." And the three men departed, shaking their heads in bewilderment, leaving Miriam alone with her sons and their miraculous abundance. Over the following weeks, Miriam carefully sold portions of the oil at the market, following Elisha's wise counsel. The oil was of such exceptional quality that merchants competed to purchase it, and word spread throughout the region about the widow's premium product. True to her word, she paid her husband's debts in full within the promised time. But the oil continued to provide for their family month after month, year after year. She was able to purchase their house from Odia's brother, expand their small business, and ensure her sons received proper education. Aaron and Micah grew into strong, faithful men who never forgot the night they witnessed their mother pour from an empty jar and receive abundance beyond measure. They told the story to their own children and grandchildren, how God had multiplied oil in the hands of a desperate widow who dared to trust when trust seemed impossible. Years later, when Miriam was an old woman surrounded by prosperity and family, people would ask her about the secret of her success. She would always smile and say, "The miracle was not in the oil that multiplied, but in the faith that dared to pour from an empty jar." God is not limited by what we lack. He's only limited by our willingness to bring him our emptiness and trust him to fill it. And in the evenings, when the oil lamps flickered in homes throughout the village, many still burning oil that traced its origins back to that miraculous night, the people would remember that sometimes the greatest abundance comes not when our jars are full, but when we have the courage to pour from what little we have, trusting that the God who created the universe from nothing can certainly create provision from our emptiness. The widow's oil became more than a solution to debt. It became a testament to the truth that faith, like oil, multiplies when poured out in trust, and that the God who notices empty jars is the same God who delights in filling them beyond our wildest dreams. For in the end, Miriam learned the most important lesson of all. We bring our emptiness to God not as a sign of our failure, but as an invitation for his abundance. And when we dare to pour out our faith, even from the smallest jar, we discover that his provision knows no limits except those we place on our own capacity to receive. The story of the widow's oil echoed through generations, a reminder that in the hands of the Almighty, even our deepest need can become our greatest testimony to his faithfulness.